I refer to a bit of a crisis, if you like. It's a crisis of trust, really, amongst the population at large. And it's not just about security. It's off the back of the financial crisis. It does go back to 9/11. There's an issue of trust here. And if people are asking questions about whether they can trust their elected representatives, which is the distinction between government and corporate sector, government is elected, it's about accountability. So perhaps a few words on what mechanisms are in place would be reassuring, actually.
I mean, I'm not terribly happy about the state of our Congress either, but that is the accountability mechanism that we have. Now, there is one other as well, but first and foremost, these days there are an incredible number, perhaps too many, committees in Congress. How effective are those review mechanisms? Well, we can come back and talk a bit about that. I think, in the three parts of our government, we have, of course, the courts that have a role as well. And so we have the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. For some part of this...
Court. That's behind closed doors.
It is, that's right.
Yeah.
And I think there's a real question here as to whether the opinions that this court authors, and it does author opinions, ought to be more available. I, for one, believe...
So you're all for transparency and a bit more openness?
Much more.
Okay.
Because I think one of the lessons learned historically is that what our courts do is really educate. And they educate through the opinions that they write. And if you wanted to look at a quite different situation, let's consider the revelations about what the CIA was doing in the Church and Pike era. I've long thought that part of what happened there was that because decisions being made within the CIA, in this instance about covert action.
When was this?
This would have been, from the 50s on into the early 70s. Were not subject to the same kind of transparent review. What really happened was that the CIA, never mind the public at large, was denied that periodic revalidation that indeed what they were doing was consistent with evolving norms of conduct expectation on the part of the public at large. So the court has a very important role in all of this. And this, I think, is a very significant thing to pause for a moment and think about, because historically the tradition, I suppose I could say, or the practice of our federal courts has been to stand back from matters of national security, from international relations, from some of these fraught political areas of foreign policy. Well, somehow I think we've got to figure out a way to let this court be more transparent. And indeed, I also serve as
so it can play more of a role
in
checking.
In this checking,
what may
but
be
also
perceived as
educating.
excesses of government.
Also educating.
Yes.
Thoughtfully reviewing and, on the one hand, reassuring, on the other hand, when it's appropriate to do so, bringing the government up, short, if you will, in check, but also to articulate what the policy is that supports the kinds of actions being taken. Now, I will say that I think that the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, made a serious mistake in not being more transparent.
They did away with let me get the name of it right, the Intelligence Oversight Board, which is made up of private citizens, as I understand it.
Yeah, the PIOB.
It sounds as if you feel that's symptomatic of some of the
it might be.
if you like.
I focus less on that than the very fact that, I'll tell a short story, if you'll indulge me. At some point, well after 9/11, a group of former general counsels were invited out to NSA and given a briefing. This was probably in the 2005-2006 period when NSA surveillance activities were a topic, once again, of press coverage. And we were shared information that essentially explained the whole activity. And I said, so why wasn't most of this made public? And no one really said in words what I'm about to say, but it was easily understood that this was not revealing this information, was part of a theoretical move on the part of the Bush administration to pull back more authority to the president. There is a strong body of thought that says that the whole legal structure that approves surveillances and so on in the context of a national security event erodes the president's inherent authority as the commander-in-chief. Right. And so this was an effort to say, we don't need to do this. This was unconstitutional from the beginning, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And I think that's part of what was going on. So this is almost a policy, political rationale. Well, I think it was a mistake, because I think what happened was the coin of the realm was eroded, and that coin, of course, is trust.
Mm-hmm. And democracy. It turns government into a much more authoritarian mechanism.
Yeah. Now, the other point I'll make, and you, of course, come from a UK tradition, an English tradition, one which I'm very interested in because there are important and interesting parallels, things we can learn. You do some of the same things in Britain as we do, but you do them under slightly different structures. We tend to think that we have exactly the same legal system. It's really not true. So it's a very interesting comparison to look at how Britain handles similar activities as does the United States, and we think about the troubles in Northern Ireland and so on. So
yes,
one mechanism... I don't know if
you've seen headlines in UK papers this morning. I suspect not. The paper you referred to earlier has as its main story a member of government saying that he should have been briefed on what security services, GCHQ, in the case of the UK, was doing, and hasn't been briefed. And this is exactly the same stuff as
I'll comment
Snowden
about,
was revealing.
and
it seems to be exactly
I'll comment
parallel
about
with
that
what you're saying about
in a minute.
The Bush administration trying to...
But before I do, let me make the point that you use in Britain a device that I think, or a mechanism that we might learn from. You have commissions of judges that actually look at some of this activity subsequent, and they've come out with some rather, in some cases, critical reports. Now, as to the GCHQ report, no, I have not read it. But I will tell you, let's go back to the point I made a few minutes earlier where I said, so one oversight mechanism is that Representative Sensenbrenner is involved in, and that is congressional oversight. And I asked you the rhetorical question, how effective is that? And the answer is it's only as effective as the members involved and as they are informed and take the time to become knowledgeable and responsible. And here I'll have to give some criticism, I think, where criticism is due. I do not think that our congressional oversight mechanisms work well. And I think that the same opinion might be said by those who work within the intelligence community who would like to feel that they are getting effective oversight. Why don't they work well? And one answer, maybe it's the main answer, is that the representatives don't have enough time to focus on this. They're too busy raising money for their next election. That's a little bit offhand, but I think there's a lot of truth in it.
It goes back to what you were saying about security issues, surveillance issues being very complex, and so you do need time to be able to focus on them and understand them fully. It's that simple, really. Does the same apply to the Senate?
I think it applies to anyone who's elected in our system.
I wanted to ask you specifically about the Senate Intelligence Committee, because Dianne Feinstein has been quoted quite frequently.
And she would, by the way, be an example of someone who does take this seriously and I think has done a fine job.
Okay, well, your answer may be predictable then to this question. She always invokes 9/11. She always goes back to the horror of 9/11 and when challenged about perhaps the NSA going too far in light of Edward Snowden's revelations. She says that I always call to mind people jumping from the building after 9/11. Now, it seems that 9/11 is being used as a trump card to trump legal and ethical considerations.
It always happens, doesn't it? It's easy to want to protect all of our individual rights and liberties when we're not threatened, but we reset the dial when we feel there's this serious threat. And I think one point, I think President Obama has tried to bring this forward in some of his recent talks, is if we want to roll back the structure of the Patriot Act and we want to say, NSA, we don't want you doing all of these things any longer, That's fine. But we need to keep in mind that there will be a risk that we take on. And maybe that's appropriate. You know, you have to ask yourself, in the United States, we have had a remarkable period of virtually no physical attacks on our home space. I say that notwithstanding that you and I are in Boston.
Sitting here in Boston, absolutely.
About
Very
a block
personal.
from where the attack occurred.
And people connected to the bombers haven't been tracked down at all, which sounds a little like a failure of intelligence.
You're talking about the bombing here in Boston. Well, assuming that there are others, and I think that's not clear that there are.
Right.
But the point I'm making
I mentioned
is,
it because Madeleine Albright referred to it yesterday evening. But, yeah.
I make the point that there is a level of risk, and we are accustomed to having no risk at all because we have lived in such a very safe environment for so many years. And so I think this is a particularly difficult psychological thing to get our arms around in the United States. Many other nations, Britain would be one, have lived through a much higher incidence of the kind of threat that we're talking about. I think we have to say there is a certain trade-off here. It is not necessarily perfectly a zero-sum game, but as you say the government will do less, you are taking on risk. And by the way, it isn't just the United States that takes on that risk, because to a significant degree, what we are able to do with our technologies benefits other parts of the world as well.